It was an ordinary afternoon when everything changed. The sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The protagonist, a hard-working homeowner, had just finished mowing the lawn, the scent of fresh grass lingering in the air. They leaned back in their chair on the porch, enjoying a brief moment of peace after a long day. But peace, as they would soon realize, was not something they would enjoy for much longer. A knock on the door, loud, insistent, the kind that signals an unwanted visitor. The protagonist frowned, wondering who could possibly be stopping by at this hour. They opened the door, greeted by the sight of a woman they immediately recognized, the notorious HOA Karen. "Excuse me," she began without a hint of pleasantry, "but I'm going to need you to remove that garden feature now." The protagonist blinked in confusion, unsure if they had heard her correctly. The garden feature in question was nothing more than a small decorative bench, surrounded by a few carefully cultivated flowers. It was an innocuous addition to their front yard, something they'd added to brighten the space, certainly nothing worth making a scene over. "Wait, what? I don't understand," the protagonist replied, trying to keep their voice steady. Karen's eyes narrowed, her stance shifting to one of authority. "I've already gone through the HOA regulations, and it's clear this is a violation. You need to remove it immediately or face legal action." Her voice was cold, like a blade that cut through the air with each word. The protagonist felt a twinge of frustration. Karen had always been trouble. She had a reputation for being the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of HOA rules, always looking for something to nitpick, some small detail she could use to exert control. But this was different. The bench had been there for years, and never once had anyone complained, not even the HOA. Trying to reason with her, the protagonist asked, "You're saying that a small garden bench violates the HOA rules?" Karen's expression hardened. "Not just the bench, the whole setup. It's not in line with the approved aesthetic of the community. And I've had enough of it. I've already spoken to the HOA board, and they support my position. If you don't take it down by the end of the week, you'll be hearing from my lawyer." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. Legal action. For a bench. The protagonist stepped back, their mind racing. What was Karen playing at? Why was she so obsessed with this? And why now? Before they could respond, Karen turned sharply on her heel, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of satisfaction and something darker. "I'm serious," she called over her shoulder. "You have until Friday. Don't make me escalate this." As the door slammed shut behind her, the protagonist stood frozen, staring at the spot where she had just been. This wasn't just about a bench. It was about power, control, and Karen seemed determined to have it, no matter the cost. The quiet neighborhood, once a sanctuary of peace, suddenly felt oppressive, as if the weight of something far more sinister was creeping into every corner. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was only the beginning. And deep down, they knew one thing for sure: Karen was not going to back down easily. The battle for their property had just begun, and the protagonist had no idea how far Karen was willing to go to win. The next few days were a blur of unsettling thoughts. Every time the protagonist stepped outside, they couldn't shake the oppressive feeling that Karen's eyes were on them. Every glance from a neighbor felt charged with silent judgment, as if the entire neighborhood was watching, waiting for something to happen. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. The protagonist had tried to move on, hoping Karen's threats would fizzle out with time. But deep down, they knew better. Karen wasn't the type to let go of a grudge so easily. And now her warning echoed in their mind. "If you don't take it down by the end of the week, you'll be hearing from my lawyer." Friday was just around the corner. It was that evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, that the letter arrived. A thick envelope, white and official, bearing the HOA logo. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat as they tore it open, half expecting it to be another one of Karen's usual complaints. But this was different. This wasn't from Karen. This was from the HOA itself. Their eyes scanned the words quickly, their stomach dropping with each sentence. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that certain landscaping features on your property are in violation of the Homeowners Association guidelines. Specifically, the decorative garden bench and surrounding flower arrangements have been deemed an unsanctioned alteration to the approved landscape aesthetic. You are required to remove the aforementioned features by the end of this week, or you will face legal action. The room seemed to spin. The HOA was siding with Karen. The very thought made the protagonist's blood run cold. Had Karen somehow convinced the board to back her? Were they really going to let her dictate the rules of the entire neighborhood, bending the HOA to her will? The protagonist slammed the letter down onto the kitchen table, breathing heavily. It wasn't just about the bench anymore. It was about the entire community being dragged into Karen's twisted game. The stakes had just been raised. As if on cue, a loud knock on the door shattered the silence. The protagonist froze. There was no mistaking it now. Karen was back. They opened the door, and there she stood, arms crossed, her face wearing a smug, self-satisfied expression. It was as if she knew she had already won. I see you got the letter, she said, her voice dripping with smugness. Don't say I didn't warn you. The protagonist clenched their jaw, trying to suppress the surge of anger that was rising within them. You manipulated the HOA into doing your dirty work. They shot back, the words coming out sharper than they had intended. Karen merely smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. The HOA's decision is final. You're the one who chose to ignore the rules. There was something about the way she said it, the way she stood there so arrogantly, that made the protagonist's blood boil. She was enjoying this, enjoying watching them squirm under the pressure she had created. And worst of all, she was convinced she was untouchable, that no one could challenge her. But the protagonist wasn't about to back down. No, not this time. They weren't just going to let Karen steamroll them, no matter how much power she thought she had. Don't think this is over, the protagonist said through gritted teeth, their voice low and dangerous. You've made a mistake if you think I'll just roll over. Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by their defiance. Oh, I don't think it's a mistake. You'll see, soon enough. But you have until the end of the week to comply. Tick-tock. With a final, condescending glance, Karen turned and strutted off, leaving the protagonist standing in the doorway, seething with frustration. The letter was still on the table, the words burning into their mind. The countdown had begun. They had a week to remove the bench or face legal action. But Karen wasn't just fighting for the rules, she was fighting for control. And the protagonist realized that if they let her win, it wouldn't just be the bench that was lost. It would be their dignity, their home. And that was something they couldn't let happen. As the week stretched ahead, the protagonist found themselves caught between fear and resolve. They knew they needed to act fast, before Karen's influence spread even further, before the HOA became her personal playground. But what could they do? The clock was ticking. The suspense hung in the air like an invisible threat, every tick of the clock marking the protagonist's dwindling options. They had no choice but to play this game. But how? How far would Karen push? And how much would they be willing to sacrifice to keep their home? And their freedom. The next move was crucial. The stakes were higher than they ever imagined. The air felt thick with pressure as the protagonist sat at the kitchen table, the letter from the HOA still lying there like a ticking time bomb. They knew they had to act, but every option seemed fraught with danger. The clock was ticking, Karen's deadline was drawing near, and they couldn't afford to sit idly by. The question now wasn't just how to fight back. It was whether they could expose Karen for the manipulative force she was. That night, unable to sleep, the protagonist decided to dig deeper. They knew the HOA rules like the back of their hand, and after years of living there, they had never seen a single regulation that forbade something as harmless as a garden bench. The more they thought about it, the more the nagging feeling crept in. There was something off about all of this. The HOA wasn't just siding with Karen. They were acting as though they'd been manipulated. As dawn broke, the protagonist fired up their laptop and began combing through the HOA's website. The rules were long, the language dense and legalistic, but they had to be sure. They needed evidence, something concrete they could use to expose Karen's scheme once and for all. The deeper they dug, the more they realized Karen wasn't just a meddling neighbor. She had been using the HOA as a weapon for years. It started small, just little disputes here and there. But over time, Karen had built a reputation as the HOA's enforcer. The protagonist found complaints from other neighbors, all related to trivial issues that Karen had pushed until they were taken seriously. A fence that was a few inches too high, a garden that was too colorful, a mailbox that wasn't perfectly aligned with the street. On the surface, these might seem like small grievances, but together, they formed a pattern that painted a disturbing picture. Karen wasn't just obsessed with rules. She was obsessed with control. Her need to dominate the neighborhood was clear. The more the protagonist read, the more it became apparent Karen wasn't following the rules. She was bending them, breaking them, and using them to destroy anyone who stood in her way. The chilling realization hit the protagonist like a ton of bricks. Karen's ultimate goal wasn't just about the bench, it was about power. By controlling the HOA, she could force homeowners to comply with her demands, pushing them into situations where they had no choice but to sell their properties she could then buy at rock-bottom prices. A plan began to form, but it was risky. The protagonist knew they were walking a fine line. Any misstep could lead to more legal battles or worse, complete isolation from the neighbors who had already begun to whisper. Karen's influence stretched deep, and if they weren't careful, they could lose more than just a garden feature. But there was something more the protagonist had discovered. In one of the HOA's older records, buried beneath pages of irrelevant documents, they found something damning. A series of mysterious transactions that suggested Karen had been buying out properties in the neighborhood for years, often under shady circumstances. The names were all too familiar. The houses she'd targeted were in prime locations, and she'd managed to get them for a fraction of their worth. The most disturbing part: the HOA board had been complicit in these deals. There were signatures, approvals, clear evidence that Karen was getting exactly what she wanted, and it was all happening under the radar. The protagonist's hands trembled as they scrolled through the pages, piecing the puzzle together. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. Karen was orchestrating a silent takeover of the entire neighborhood. The next step was clear. They needed to expose Karen. But how? If Karen could manipulate the HOA so easily, what were the odds of getting them to turn against her? The protagonist knew that without the right evidence and allies, Karen's web of control would remain intact. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about saving their bench anymore. This was about saving their home, and possibly the entire neighborhood, from Karen's ruthless grip. But how could they pull off such a risky move? Would anyone believe them? Or had Karen already cemented her reign over the HOA, too powerful to challenge? The suspense simmered in the back of the protagonist's mind as they realized one painful truth. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a predator, and the neighborhood was her prey. And now the protagonist was the only one who stood between her and the ultimate prize. The clock was ticking. The protagonist sat at their desk, staring at the screen, the evidence they'd uncovered hanging over them like a dark cloud. The pieces of the puzzle were almost in place, but there was a chilling realization. They were running out of time. Karen had given them a deadline, Friday, and every hour that passed brought the neighborhood closer to falling under her control. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. The protagonist knew that the stakes had reached a dangerous threshold. The HOA's letter had made it clear: remove the garden feature or face legal consequences. But now, it wasn't just the bench at risk. It was their entire home, their neighborhood, their community. This was more than a petty squabble over a piece of lawn decor. Karen's agenda was far larger, and it was time to act before she could tighten her grip even further. The protagonist's plan was risky, but there was no other option. They would confront the HOA head-on, armed with the damning evidence they had uncovered. But first, they needed to strike back at Karen, and fast. They left the house in a hurry, determined to gather information and allies. The community meeting was in 2 days, and it would be their last chance to gather support. As the protagonist walked down the familiar sidewalk, they couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen was already watching. Surveillance. The idea twisted in the back of their mind. Had Karen been keeping tabs on them, knowing their every move? Turning a corner, the protagonist's instincts went on high alert when they saw a shadow slip behind a tree. It was her. Karen, in her usual methodical manner, was watching from across the street, her eyes locked onto the protagonist with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator. For a split second, time seemed to slow. The protagonist knew that whatever came next could be the turning point in this battle. But instead of retreating, they stood firm and faced Karen's watchful eyes. The first strike had to be theirs. A sudden idea hit them. It wasn't enough just to expose Karen's manipulations. It was time to make her feel the heat of her own game. The protagonist turned and walked into a neighbor's house, a retired couple who had been living in the neighborhood for decades and who had already expressed some doubts about Karen's increasing influence. The conversation was brief but vital. They were in. With a few words of encouragement and the promise of support, the protagonist had secured a key ally. The next morning, they returned to the house with a sense of urgency. A quiet phone call to another neighbor, someone they trusted, had led to the same conclusion. Others had been quietly unhappy with Karen's tactics for years, but no one had dared speak out for fear of retribution. Until now. The plan was taking shape. With their new allies in tow, the protagonist and their small coalition began gathering evidence. Photos of the properties Karen had quietly bought, old email chains, even a few whispered stories from neighbors who had been silenced or forced to sell their homes to Karen at unfair prices. The proof was mounting, and each piece added weight to the growing case against Karen. But Karen wasn't sitting idle. The very next day, as the protagonist gathered their thoughts and readying their evidence for the community meeting, they received an unexpected knock on the door. It was the HOA. A tall man in a sharply pressed suit stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He introduced himself as the HOA's lawyer, and his presence sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. "I've been sent to discuss the situation regarding the garden bench," the lawyer said, voice calm, professional, but with an underlying sense of authority. "You're aware of the HOA's decision. Legal action is imminent unless the matter is resolved." The protagonist's pulse quickened. So Karen was pulling all the stops. The lawyer was here to pressure them, to remind them that they were up against a well-oiled machine. "I'll be removing the bench as requested," the protagonist replied, their voice steady, even though their mind raced with the implications. They had to stay calm. But then came the real surprise. "We've also been made aware of certain other complaints," the lawyer said, flipping through a file. "It seems you've made alterations to your property that may not be in compliance with the HOA standards. We'll need to assess your yard in the next 24 hours. The implications were clear. Karen had already started her next wave of attacks. She wasn't just after the bench anymore. She was preparing to bring the full force of the HOA down on the protagonist. The suspense soared as the protagonist's mind whirled. Karen had already positioned herself as the ultimate victor. Could they really pull off the reveal in time? Or was Karen's network too powerful to break? As the lawyer turned to leave, he added, "We'll be expecting full cooperation." The door closed with a soft click, but the echo of those words rang loudly in the protagonist's ears. The battle was on, and the first strike had been made. But the real war was just beginning. The lawyer's visit left the protagonist in a state of heightened anxiety. The weight of the impending legal action hung over them like an insurmountable mountain, and every word spoken by the lawyer seemed to dig the threat deeper into their mind. Karen had orchestrated this, using the HOA as her weapon, and now she was tightening her grip. But the protagonist wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not by a long shot. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, the protagonist paced back and forth in their living room. The evidence they had gathered spread out before them like a map of war. The photographs, emails, and testimonies from neighbors, all of it had the potential to unravel Karen's empire, but it was still incomplete. They needed more. Something more explosive. Something that would expose Karen's manipulation for good. The meeting was just days away, and the protagonist could feel the pressure building. Karen knew they were preparing a counterattack. That much was obvious, but they had to stay ahead of her. It was clear now that the HOA lawyer's visit was a mere formality, a power play to keep the protagonist on edge. And it was working. With a deep breath, the protagonist decided it was time to take a step further. Time to infiltrate Karen's world and discover exactly how deep her influence really ran. If Karen was using the HOA to push her agenda, surely she had other alliances, other players in her pocket. The next morning, the protagonist donned a mask of calm determination. They couldn't afford to look flustered now, not with everything at stake. There was one person who might know more about Karen's dealings than anyone else. Melody, the quiet widow who lived a few doors down. Melody had lived in the neighborhood for decades and was a well-known figure at HOA meetings. She had always kept to herself, but the protagonist knew that she had a sharp mind. And most importantly, she wasn't afraid to speak out. The conversation began innocently enough, as they shared pleasantries over a cup of coffee. But the protagonist had a singular focus, getting Melody to trust them. After a few minutes of light conversation, the protagonist casually mentioned the recent HOA decisions. Melody's eyes flickered with unease, but she didn't say anything at first. The silence hung thick, and the protagonist pressed on, trying to maintain a casual air. It's strange, isn't it, how Karen has so much sway with the HOA board. Melody stiffened, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted her glasses. The protagonist knew they had her attention. Karen, Melody muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She's been working with the HOA for years, but it's not just the board. She's got connections, powerful ones. The protagonist leaned in, their pulse quickening. What do you mean? Who is she working with? Melody hesitated. The fear in her eyes was evident. Whatever Karen was involved in was far bigger than the protagonist had realized. Finally, Melody spoke in hushed tones. Karen's been using her influence to manipulate the HOA decisions for months. But what most people don't know, she's been buying up properties under the table, using hidden accounts and false identities. She's been positioning herself to take over the entire neighborhood. The words hit like a punch to the gut. The protagonist's worst fears were coming true. Karen wasn't just after a few petty victories. She was building an empire. But Melody wasn't done. And the worst part, some of the board members are complicit. They've been accepting bribes for years. Karen knows how to get to them. I don't know all the details, but I know this. If you try to stand up to her, you'll be crushed. She'll make sure of it. The protagonist felt a chill spread down their spine. Karen had set this all up, a silent takeover of the neighborhood, wrapped in legal documents and HOA regulations. But Melody's voice trembled as she spoke again. I can't help you, not directly. But you're not alone. A few of us, people who still care about this community, we've been quietly trying to stop her. You can't win this battle alone. The words hit home. The protagonist wasn't alone. There were others, just as desperate to take down Karen's reign of terror. But could they be trusted? The protagonist left Melody's house with more questions than answers, the gravity of what they'd just learned settling heavily in their chest. Karen's empire was bigger than they ever imagined. The pieces were falling into place, and the battle was only getting darker. As they walked back home, a realization dawned. The fight was no longer just about the bench, or even the HOA. It was about saving their home, their neighborhood, and the people who still believed in the values that Karen had destroyed. The tension was unbearable, the stakes rising higher by the second. The protagonist knew the next move had to be perfect. The stakes had never been higher. Would they take Karen down before it was too late? Or was she already one step ahead, ready to strike again? Time was running out. The protagonist's mind was racing as they walked back home from Melody's house. The information they'd uncovered felt like a bombshell. Karen had been playing a long game, and the stakes were higher than ever. But now, the urgency hit them like a jolt of electricity. The HOA meeting was in less than 24 hours, and everything hinged on this one moment. They had no choice but to confront Karen and the HOA head-on, but there was something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. As they arrived home, the tension in the air was thick. The garden bench, the simple object that had started this entire chain of events, felt like a symbol of defiance. But now, it was a ticking time bomb, and every second they hesitated, Karen's grip on the neighborhood tightened. The protagonist immediately got to work. They gathered the evidence that would expose Karen's influence over the HOA, the photos, the documents, the testimonies, and spread them out on the kitchen table. This was it, the final push. But with the clock running down, they couldn't afford to miss a single detail. Just as they were about to finalize their presentation for the HOA meeting, a sudden knock on the door jolted them from their thoughts. A quick glance out the window revealed a familiar figure. It was Karen. This wasn't just a casual visit. The way Karen stood there, arms crossed, an almost predatory glint in her eyes, made it clear she wasn't here to discuss lawn decor. She had come to make her move. The protagonist opened the door cautiously, trying to keep their emotions in check. "What do you want, Karen?" they asked, their voice steady but tinged with suspicion. "Oh, I just wanted to make sure we're all clear about the meeting tomorrow," Karen said, her smile cold and rehearsed. "I wouldn't want any misunderstandings. You'll be removing that bench, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to make things more difficult for yourself than they already are." The protagonist's pulse quickened, but they kept their composure. Karen was trying to rattle them. She knew they were preparing for the HOA meeting, and she was using her typical intimidation tactics to get under their skin. But this time, it wasn't working. "I'll be at the meeting tomorrow," the protagonist said, their tone firm. "And I'll have the evidence to back up everything I've said." Karen's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was small, but it was enough. She wasn't expecting this kind of resistance, and for a moment, the protagonist saw a flicker of doubt cross Karen's face. But it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by a steely resolve. "We'll see how much evidence you really have," Karen said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're not the only one with tricks up their sleeve, you know." With a final, cold smile, Karen turned on her heel and stalked off down the driveway, leaving the protagonist standing in the doorway, heart racing. That was the moment. Karen was more dangerous than they had realized, and she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Inside, the protagonist's mind raced. Karen knew the game was about to shift. She was growing desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. It was a fact the protagonist would use to their advantage. Tomorrow was the day the gloves came off. As the hours passed, the protagonist went over their presentation one last time, making sure every piece of evidence was airtight. They couldn't afford any missteps, not with Karen lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. The meeting would be a battlefield, and the protagonist had to be ready to fight for their home, their future, and the neighborhood they had once loved. With the documents tucked under their arm and their mind focused, they glanced one last time at the garden bench in the yard. It had started with a simple dispute over a piece of furniture. But now, it was the symbol of everything they had worked for, a stand against Karen's tyranny, and a fight for control of their community. The protagonist took a deep breath, steeling themselves for the storm that was about to break. The meeting tomorrow would determine everything. And the worst part, no one knew what Karen was truly capable of. No one knew just how far she would go to win. And tomorrow, they would find out just how dangerous this game really was. The night before the HOA meeting, the protagonist barely slept. Their mind whirled with every possible scenario, every potential move Karen might make, every argument she might throw, and every piece of evidence they still needed to solidify their case. The air was thick with tension. It wasn't just the weight of the meeting ahead, but the knowledge that Karen would be ready for this. She always was. At first light, the protagonist dressed in their best attire, business casual, but sharp, projecting confidence. They took a deep breath as they looked out the window at the garden bench. That bench had become a symbol of everything they were fighting for. A simple garden feature, now the focal point of a war that had escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. Arriving at the community center where the HOA meeting would take place, the protagonist immediately noticed the undercurrent of tension. Karen was already there, standing at the front, whispering to a few of the board members, her posture exuding dominance. The HOA lawyer, who had visited the protagonist just days earlier, was also present, his presence a chilling reminder of the stakes. But the protagonist wasn't intimidated. They walked to the front of the room, moving with purpose. They could feel the eyes of the neighbors on them, some sympathetic, others uncertain. This wasn't just about a bench anymore. This was about exposing the truth, about pulling back the veil on the corruption that had festered in the HOA for years. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the protagonist could sense the tension mounting. Karen was quick to assert her dominance, speaking with a level of confidence that only further reinforced her control over the board. As you all know, she began, her voice dripping with feigned sincerity. There are rules that must be followed. It's not just about my personal preferences. It's about maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood. The protagonist could hear the subtle undercurrent in her words. Integrity. Karen didn't care about integrity. She cared about control. When it was finally their turn to speak, the protagonist stood tall. The room fell silent. The HOA members, many of them Karen's allies, watched with interest as the protagonist began to lay out the case. I've been a member of this community for years, they started, their voice steady. And like many of you, I've always respected the rules of the HOA. But recently, things have started to feel off. The tension in the room thickened. The protagonist could feel Karen's glare cutting into them, but they pressed on. Karen, you've made it clear that you want that bench gone. But I've done my homework, and what I found isn't just about this one garden feature. It's about a much bigger issue, one that involves corruption, manipulation, and a hidden agenda. The room was silent as the protagonist began presenting the evidence, photographs, email exchanges, and testimonies from neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before. One by one, they dismantled Karen's carefully crafted facade. They spoke of the hidden property deals, the bribes, the coercion, and the underhanded tactics Karen had used to slowly acquire the neighborhood, all while hiding behind the guise of HOA rules. I've got a list of names, the protagonist continued, holding up a piece of paper. Board members who've turned a blind eye to Karen's actions. Neighbors who've been forced to sell their homes to her at ridiculously low prices. People who've been too scared to speak out, until now. Karen's face had gone pale, her usual confidence slipping. This was the moment. I'm not just fighting for a bench, the protagonist said, their voice now firm and unwavering. I'm fighting for this neighborhood, for its future. For all of us who still believe in fairness and integrity. If Karen's allowed to continue manipulating this HOA, she will control everything, and we will be powerless. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some of them clearly torn between their loyalty to Karen and the overwhelming evidence now in front of them. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She stood abruptly, her voice sharp and cutting. This is a lie, a smear campaign. All of this is fabricated, she yelled, her composure completely shattered. They've made up these stories to destroy me. But the damage had been done. The room was no longer on her side. The neighbors were beginning to whisper, casting glances at one another, exchanging looks of disbelief. The storm was breaking. The tide had shifted, and the protagonist could see it in the faces of the people in the room. They weren't just convinced, they were angry. Karen's reign of terror was finally being exposed. And then, just as the board members began to murmur amongst themselves, the twist came. A voice from the back of the room cut through the chaos. "I've seen enough." It was Melody, the quiet widow, standing at the back of the room, holding up her own set of documents. Her allies had come forward. And now, it wasn't just the protagonist who had the evidence. Melody had known the truth all along, and she was finally ready to share it. The final nail in Karen's coffin had been driven. The protagonist turned to look at Melody, their heart pounding with disbelief and gratitude. The cavalry had arrived, and Karen's empire was about to collapse. The room was electric with the realization that this was the end of Karen's control. The protagonist had played their cards perfectly, and now, the community was on the verge of reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. The moment Melody stepped forward, holding up the documents that would seal Karen's fate, the air in the room shifted. The board members exchanged glances, unsure of what to do, while the neighbors, once timid, now leaned forward with a palpable sense of anticipation. This was it, the final moment. Karen's face had drained of color, her usual smug expression now replaced with wide-eyed panic. The protagonist watched her closely, feeling a sense of power surge through them. Karen, once the queen of the HOA, now stood on the precipice of losing everything. And it was all unfolding right before their eyes. Melody's voice, steady and calm, cut through the tension. "I've been gathering information on Karen for years," she said, her eyes meeting the protagonist's with a quiet resolve. "I didn't know who to trust, but now I know I'm not alone." She paused, looking at Karen with disdain. "I've seen the contracts, the falsified records, the forged signatures. Karen has been using her influence to manipulate the entire neighborhood. She's been buying properties under false pretenses and using HOA fees to line her own pockets." The documents in Melody's hands were the final proof, the smoking gun that would tear Karen's carefully constructed empire apart. As Melody passed the papers to the board members, the room grew eerily silent. Every eye was on the pages as the board members skimmed through the damning evidence. The protagonist stood back, letting the moment unfold. They could feel the weight of the years of tension, of silent battles fought in the shadows, all coming to a head in this single, powerful instant. Karen's reign was over. Karen's usual composure had cracked completely. She stepped forward, her voice trembling, but her words were still venomous. "You think you've won," she spat, her face contorted with rage. "This isn't over. You have no idea what I can do." But the protagonist wasn't fazed. They knew the truth was on their side. The community was on their side. Karen was out of cards to play. "I think it is over, Karen," the protagonist said, their voice firm and unyielding. "Your game is up. The neighbors know the truth now. The HOA board can no longer protect you." Karen took a step back, her eyes darting around the room, realizing the full extent of her downfall. She had no allies left in this room, no one who would stand with her. Her power, which had once felt invincible, was slipping away like sand through her fingers. A few of the board members shifted uneasily, their loyalties now in question. One of them, a man who had been an unwavering supporter of Karen, stood up and addressed the room. This is unacceptable," he muttered, his voice wavering. "We've been complicit in all of this, but we won't be anymore." The moment was electric. The protagonist's heart raced as the board members, one by one, began to speak out against Karen's actions, admitting to their own roles in the corruption. The floodgates had opened. Karen's face twisted in disbelief, her eyes flicking between the protagonist and the board members who had just turned on her. She was alone. The weight of her betrayal, her lies, and her manipulation had caught up to her, and she was no longer in control. I can fix this," Karen stammered, her voice weak now, almost pleading. "I'll give the properties back. I'll fix everything. Just give me one more chance." But it was too late. The community had seen through her lies, and they weren't buying it anymore. The protagonist knew this moment was pivotal. This wasn't just about Karen losing the HOA's power. It was about reclaiming the integrity of the neighborhood, about showing that even the most insidious forms of corruption could be toppled. The board voted, and the decision was unanimous. Karen's actions were officially condemned, her position with the HOA was revoked, and her properties would be investigated further. The entire community would begin to heal, but not without a reminder of what had nearly been lost. As the meeting adjourned and the neighbors began to trickle out, the protagonist felt a mixture of relief and triumph. The battle had been hard-fought, but they had won. As they walked out of the community center, a few neighbors came up to them, offering congratulations and expressions of gratitude. Melody, too, stood with a quiet smile, her eyes full of warmth. "You did it," she said, her voice soft. "You brought us all together." The protagonist looked around, feeling the weight of everything they had fought for. The garden bench, once a symbol of defiance, now felt like a small victory in a much larger war. They had taken back control, not just of their property, but of their community, their future. And as they walked back home, a sense of peace washed over them. Karen's empire had crumbled, but it had been replaced with something stronger: unity, fairness, and hope. The storm was over, but the protagonist knew one thing for sure: there would be no going back. They had fought for the neighborhood, and they had won. The reckoning had arrived, and with it, a new era for the community.